Welcome back. You are looking at Brighter Morning with Bhoe, and my name is Bhoe Tiwari. This is MCTV, Cultural TV in Trinidad and Tobago, beaming throughout Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. We have a caller on the line. Is that it? You have a caller? Sorry? Oh, we have Justin on the line. Okay, great. Dr. Ram, good morning. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly, and I see you now too. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm doing well. It's a couple of days since we had a passage of Hurricane Elsa here in Barbados, but like your show, I think we're seeing a brighter morning this morning with it.
All right, very good. Thank you for saying brighter morning. Tell me, you are in Barbados. You're based in Barbados now, is that correct? Tell me a little bit about what the hurricane did to Barbados. We saw some clips on the news, and we have an idea, but you are there on the ground, so you would have a feel of what happened.
Yes, well, as you know, Friday morning, we in Barbados, we were expecting Tropical Storm Elsa, but just as that storm approached Barbados, it was upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane. Luckily for us, it passed just south of the island, but that didn't mean that the island was not impacted. So we had a number of homes actually being toppled over as a result of the hurricane. Many people lost their roofs as well. And for a considerable proportion of the island population, they were without power and water for a number of days. In fact, the Barbados Light and Power utility is still in the process of trying to reconnect households and businesses to the grid, because what happened, Bhoe, was that about 45 transformers were destroyed as a result of the hurricane. And if I'm not mistaken, around 200 light poles were taken down.
Sure.
So as you could well imagine, that has left considerable damage, and now they're trying to restore service. Some neighborhoods are still without water. Luckily for me, where I am, and I think I'm protected because of where my house is situated in the Rendezvous Christchurch area, I didn't have any damage to my home, and I only lost power and water for a couple of hours on Friday. So I was spared. I was spared the worst of it.
Yeah, these natural disasters are very devastating, not just from an island level or a country level, but they are very devastating to the individual homeowner and the individual citizen and resident. Because, you know, when something happens and you have no water, your life is in a mess. And we are coming out of COVID where everybody's life has been put in a kind of, what can I say, a kind of halt position in a way, and uncertainty. And really people have had a lot of personal crises to deal with. If your water and your electricity is gone, that is another matter, because it affects your refrigerator, it affects everything about your life. And, you know, if you have electricity poles across the street and trees across the street, it means that you have a traffic problem until they get to the solution to the problem, the removal of the debris, etc. And these things can be very, very hard on the human spirit. How are Barbadians coping in this time? And it's a small island, and people are quite close in that island, I mean, in the way that they relate to each other. How are people coping with that?
Well, I mean, it's been very very difficult, and Bhoe, because over the last, well, what I should say, well, maybe 18 months now, people have been dealing with COVID.
Of course.
Then earlier this year, people dealt with the fallout from the volcanic ash from Mount Soufriere in St. Vincent, and now this, and so people are asking what else. I mean, so one of the areas that I think also we in the Caribbean have to be mindful of are the psychosocial impacts of these types of events. Because what you tend to have happening is a lot of wounded people walking around. You know, they may not be physically wounded, but they are wounded mentally. And I
Psychologically
think that
wounded, yes. Yes.
psychological wounding, and I think that this is an area we don't pay enough attention to. But I should say the Barbadian people are showing a great sense of resilience. The government has reacted very well, and we have a very good government here in Barbados because this government communicates very well with the population. They are there. The prime minister is on the ground. She is doing her survey of the damage for herself. And what tends to happen is that there's an announcement right away around what needs to change policy wise. So there's a catastrophic fund that the government has, which was oriented towards post-disaster assistance. And now they're saying that's not good enough. It needs to be pre. So we need to build resilience in advance. Why wait until something happens to assist people? We are now thinking about building resilience beforehand. So that's a really good policy change that I'm hearing coming out of the government.
Yeah, well, I've had interaction with the Barbados Prime Minister when she was in the opposition. And I know that not only is she a very resilient person, but she's a creative person. And more than that, she's not afraid to make decisions. And she's not afraid to change things. And given the overwhelming victory that she had in the last election, I think she has built upon that to generate a lot of trust with the Barbadian people. And that kind of credibility goes a long way. When you have a crisis, at least people listen and they pay attention and they are willing to be receptive and give you the benefit of the doubt. And I think she has that, notwithstanding all the other problems in Barbados. And Barbados does have a few problems, which we will get to in a minute. Okay. Do you think the government continues to have the kind of overwhelming support that they came into office with, or what has happened since?
Well, of course, this government came into a situation where the economy was in a very, very difficult place. When they arrived, so when they were sworn in, there was about 3.5 weeks worth of foreign exchange reserves. That meant they had to take very severe and strong action immediately with respect to getting their fiscal accounts back in order, because what was happening was that for a number of years, the government of Barbados, before this current one, was running perennial deficits. And so that meant the debt to GDP ratio rose to as much as almost 170% of GDP. And as you know, Bhoe, that is unsustainable, because research has shown that once you cross the 60% debt to GDP threshold, that has a considerable drag on economic growth. And more importantly, it has a drag on investor confidence, because people just feel that something has to happen in the future and they don't want to invest. So the government took a very difficult decision. It had to realign that. And I think during that process for the first 2 years, this government really had great support from the population. But then COVID happened, and that meant the government had to take more serious decisions to protect life. So the medical situation became a priority, and that, of course, had a knock-on impact on the economy, as in everywhere in the world. And now you're having these other natural disasters. So I think there might be some loss of popularity, but I think overall the government is still fairly popular, because I think one thing with Barbadians is that they're very educated people and they understand the situation around them, particularly if you communicate with them and you come clean and you come honestly to them and tell them this is what is happening, this is what is required to get us back on track.
And Barbados is also a society that coheres well. That is to say, they've always had this tradition, regardless of who is the government, in which government, business, labor, the NGO sector have basically sort of had ongoing consultations during the course of any given year and over a number of years in any administration, so that the hard and challenging issues can be discussed and worked out and contending opinions attended to, etc. So at the end of the day, at least people understand that they have been listened to, their points of view have been taken into account, and with the hard decisions, at the end of the day, it's the government that has to make the decision, even if they consult. And I think that that has gone a long way in building some trust capacity in the society. Would you say that?
I agree. So they've had this social partnership in place for quite some
Yes,
time.
it's been over a decade, about 15 or 20 years.
Yes, I think over a couple of decades now, and that has worked to the benefit, because when this government came into power, they immediately called the social partnership together to say, okay, this is where we are and what should we do. And so there's a lot of consultation, ongoing consultation all the time. And what is also quite good, Bhoe, is that in the economic reform program, what's called the Barbados Economic Reform and Transformation Program, BERT, fondly, what happens there is that there is a head of the private sector who chairs an overall monitoring committee for that and reports to the population on a quarterly basis on how the government and how the economy is performing. So that brings a greater level of scrutiny, but also trust that you have someone from outside of government making the government accountable for what it said it was going to do. And there's really, really good, honest discussion that happens here. And I think that builds on this trust. And so part of that includes labor. It also includes the non-NGO sector. So all facets, all areas of society are well represented.
All key stakeholders, yes. Now,
Yes,
Barbados,
yes.
as you said, when this government came into office, things were pretty bad. And you had about 3 weeks of foreign exchange. And in a sense, they had no choice. And they took a decision, a hard decision by any standard, to enter into a relationship with the IMF. Can you talk a little bit about that? First of all, what did they do? Why did they do it? What did they commit to doing out of the arrangement? And where are they now? Where is the country Barbados now?
Yes. Well, I think even before the government came into power, Mottley, as you know, was opposition leader then, and there were already signals before this government won office that they would be seeking international assistance to reform the economy if they were elected. So this didn't come as a surprise
The signal
to
was
the
clear.
general population.
Yeah.
The signal was clear. And so within their manifesto, they, of course, indicated the areas of their economic reform that they would try to pursue. Now, as you know, Bhoe, when a country goes to the IMF now, the IMF is really coming in to support what's called homegrown initiatives. So the country puts forward ideas around how it wants to reform, and the IMF and other international financial institutions give the thumbs up, or if there's a thumbs down, they work with you on what needs to be improved upon. But it's now a much more of a partnership arrangement. But that meant that once they went to the IMF, it then opened up very, very cheap sources of finance to help the Barbados government weather this economic transformation program. So that it meant they got resources from the IMF, cheap resources from the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as cheap resources from the Caribbean Development Bank. And even because Barbados has now graduated and no longer is eligible for assistance from the World Bank, because of the significant reforms that the government of Barbados was implementing, even the World Bank showed interest in providing support to Barbados. That means that the government now has breathing room. It can borrow and refinance its existing debt at a much lower cost, and it allows it now to have the ability to have the fiscal space to run the types of primary balances that are required to get that debt to GDP down to where it needs to be over a period of time. Of course, with COVID and now with these natural disasters, some of the anchors, the debt anchors that were stipulated in the original IMF program, might have been adjusted somewhat, so it's been extended for a couple of years. But it means that the Barbados government is still on track to achieve its overall goals of bringing the debt to GDP down to a reasonable level, more manageable, and to get the economy on a growth path.
Did Barbados approach the IMF for any money under the Rapid Credit Facility or the Rapid Finance Facility, which were made available when the COVID crisis hit? Because that was a significant amount of funds that the IMF made available at a very, very concessional rate to countries around the world. I think some 85 countries took advantage of those facilities. Was Barbados one of them?
Well, because Barbados was already in this IMF program and they were running a very, I should say, strong fiscal surplus, so it was around 6% of GDP, Barbados actually had money there which it could utilize to support the economy with, without the need to go to borrow. And so they got the concession from the IMF that instead of running what the program stipulated as a 6% fiscal surplus, they could run maybe a 1%. So it meant it left them with some fiscal space of money
room.
that they had. Yes, that they could then spend. So there wasn't really much of a need to borrow additionally to support the economy. And of course, in COVID, there would be an inclination to spend on capital projects, but even that became difficult to implement. So the government has room. Luckily, the IMF has given its room to spend on capital projects to help stimulate the economy. The issue now, of course, Bhoe, as we all have across the Caribbean, is implementation. But so there wasn't a need for the government to borrow, just to answer your point.
Okay, I want to talk about three complementary things. And as an economist who understands the region, and I know you understand the region way, way beyond Barbados or Trinidad and Tobago, I know you understand the Caribbean region and the Latin American region. I want to ask you three things, and they are related, and you can speak to them in any manner that would be comfortable or meaningful to you. The first thing is, what is being done in Barbados now to cause the tourism industry to recover? Because that's the mainstay of the Barbados industry. Barbados is a services-oriented country, and tourism is its major project. Secondly, Barbados now has, with the IMF program, the fiscal space for public works expenditure, that is to say construction or related projects. But what is happening in the private sector in Barbados? Because you have a private sector in Barbados that it's pretty differentiated. You have very, very small and micro enterprises. You have medium enterprises, but you also have some big international companies, players in Barbados as well. You have some foreign investment, especially in the finances sector, and you have big players in the tourism sector as well as small players in the tourism sector. So the business sector is pretty variegated. And then the other issue that I want to tie with that is the issue of debt refinancing. Because when when the new government came into the picture, they came into the picture with an inherited debt of over 100, debt to GDP of over 100%. If I'm not mistaken, it might have been over 150%. You may be more accurate on that. And there is no way that a country can manage its affairs and carry that debt and service the debt at the same time. So what is happening with debt refinancing? So the three things then: debt refinancing, tourism, and the role of the private sector.
Okay, well, let me start with the first one. So with the tourism industry, of course, the priority is to protect lives and so to protect the domestic population from the effects of COVID. And that has meant that the government has had a fairly decent rollout of vaccines across the island. So I think it's maybe around 30, almost 30%, no, not as much as 30, maybe 25% of the population has now been fully vaccinated, and that vaccination program continues. But in addition to that, what this government has actually done is laid out protocols for the re-entry of tourists. So it is very, very clear. If you go on to the Barbados tourism websites, you can see what rules apply. So, for example, if you are a fully vaccinated tourist or visitor to the island, you simply need to come in, have a COVID test done, and if that test result comes back negative, you are free to leave any quarantine facilities within 24 to 48 hours. So it means it brings a level of certainty. It also means that children traveling with adult visitors follow the same rules as the adults. So if the adult is fully vaccinated and they are negative, then the children are also allowed to leave. So that has brought greater certainty. I think the government has been able to do that because they feel as if the majority of the vulnerable domestic population has received a vaccine. Not all, but the majority. So there's probably gaining some type of herd immunity around the vulnerable population. So I think so Barbados has signaled that it is open, and so that its tourism industry is ready to accept visitors. But it also depends on the source markets and how they are going. Barbados receives a number of visitors, most of their visitors certainly from the UK, the US, and Canada. And I think once those economies start to reopen, people will start coming back into Barbados. Already the hoteliers are saying that for the early winter months of this year, bookings are very, very strong. So that's a good thing. As it relates to fiscal space and public works, we all know that what the government has been doing there, but also with respect to the private sector. Only this week I was speaking with a colleague of mine, and he was saying that we have to admire the resilience of the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, because a day or two after the passage of Hurricane Elsa, they are already back on the streets. Coconut vendors are there doing their thing. People are there selling their fruits on the side of the road. So there's a great resilience there from micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise
but that has
entrepreneurs.
That has been facilitated by government policy, though, to make those things possible. They didn't ask them to stay home and stay away from business and stay away from work. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
That is correct. And what has happened is that, so immediately after the hurricane, of course, for maybe 24 to 48 hours, people were asked to take precautions because while things were being cleaned up. But then after that, people were allowed to get on to do their businesses based on whether they had the ability to do so themselves. And so you do see vendors out and about now again. Now, with respect to large businesses, I mean, they have been hit quite considerably from the impact of COVID and the restrictions caused by that. But the government is actively trying to improve the business environment to make it easier for them to do business. So those that are able to right now, because the economy is gradually reopening, there's now greater movement. There's no more curfew in Barbados. People are free to move about. There are some restrictions on the amount of people who can gather together. But generally, things are getting back to normalcy. I think what we're going to see is that even big businesses are going to reap the benefits of that, particularly later this year as tourists start to come back into the economy. I am not sure what's happening with respect to the financial institutions. Of course, they must have been under some strain because there must be some loans that are non-performing at this point in time. But I imagine that many of those non-performing loans will return to performance after tourists start to arrive again and the economy starts to churn. So I think it's really, really important to balance the medical emergency and, of course, the economic crisis so that you don't have a situation where the cure is worse than the illness. Yes?
Okay. What about the refinancing?
So, with respect to debt refinancing, when this government came in, they had to take a very difficult decision to default on debt. And as you know, I used to work in one of these international financial institutions. And normally we would suggest if you're going to default, maybe you should only default on your foreign debt. But the government took the difficult decision that it defaulted on its entire debt because it wanted to treat all creditors equally. And that's a philosophy that depends on the type of debt repayment profiles that governments might have. I think that that is a useful thing to consider if your debt to GDP is very high. And at the time, the debt to GDP ratio in Barbados was close to 170. So that's 170% of GDP. So drastic measures were required. In other countries, I think where the debt to GDP is perhaps approaching 100%, I think that debt refinancing and debt reprofiling is something that must be considered. And what do I mean there? Not necessarily that they need to default on their debt, but they need to find some way to bring down the cost of interest. Because when the Barbados government came into power, if I'm not mistaken, around 7% of GDP was being spent on interest repayments alone. That's a significant amount. And so the idea is to bring that down. And I think this is where going into an IMF supported program, because that then gives you the cover to then get much cheaper financing from the IMF, the IDB, the CDB, for example, which you can then use to refinance some of your existing debt. So you pay out your existing debt to the private sector creditors, and that brings down your overall cost of debt. And perhaps it also extends the debt over a longer period of time so that the time to maturity may increase significantly, let's say from less than 10 years to maybe over 20 years, making the debt servicing much more manageable. So I think that always has to be one of the tools in the policy toolbox that governments have to consider when
you know the Trinidad and Tobago situation and the economy here pretty well. We are now at about 86% debt to GDP ratio. The government came to Parliament a few days ago and they raised the development loan ceiling again, and the Minister of Finance here is on record as chastising those people who indicate that we should not continue to borrow in the same way. Do you think that on the debt side, Trinidad and Tobago is in any danger? And should we in Trinidad and Tobago be thinking of debt refinancing even as we need financing to fund some of the things that we might want to do?
Well, I do think that Trinidad and Tobago's debt trajectory is in the wrong direction, and it needs to be corrected sooner rather than later. Because if you allow it to continue, the economic medicine is going to be so much more painful. So I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that the debt to GDP trajectory is on the wrong side of things and needs to be going down rather than continuing going up. What I think policymakers refuse to admit to is that government spending has a limit as to how much economic growth that spurs. Because as I mentioned to you, there's research that shows that once the debt to GDP ratio crosses a certain threshold, it actually brings a drag on the rest of the economy because it reduces investor confidence. And I think what we have to realize in Trinidad and Tobago is that the economy needs to be more reorientated towards private sector-led growth. And so along with possibly debt refinancing, putting the fiscal accounts on a sustainable path, there needs to be an acknowledgement that the economy needs to be reformed so that the private sector can become the engine of growth. Trinidad and Tobago has a foundation. It's a fairly well-diversified economy. You know, Bhoe, if you take out the oil and gas sector from that equation, the rest of the economy is fairly well-diversified. And you need to focus on the rest of the diversified economy to see what is required to help that part of the economy grow. The non-oil economy needs to be given the support to grow. And it's not going to be supported if the government continues to borrow and provides this cloud over the economic uncertainty that comes with high debt to GDP levels is a real big drag. And that needs to be corrected right away. And I think now is the time to do it in the midst, even within this crisis, because what's going to happen is that investors are not going to have the confidence to invest in Trinidad.
You would recommend a relook at the debt financing strategy now and maybe go for debt refinancing and a shift by the government to facilitate the further engagement, the deeper engagement of the private sector in Trinidad and Tobago before things go awry. Is that correct?
Yes, now is the time, Bhoe, and if I should be bold enough, now is a very good time to perhaps ask the international financial institutions, including the IMF, for support, because it means that the medicine, the homegrown program, could be a lot more palatable. If you wait longer, that medicine is probably going to be a lot tougher, and the population is going to feel the effects of it. So now is the time to go to them, get refinancing, and try to reform your economy so that it becomes much more private sector led in terms of its trajectory.
Justin, I want to thank you very much for coming on the program. We have to break now for the news, but this discussion is so important, and I had so many things that I wanted to ask you about the Caribbean region and Latin America in relation to what's happening post-COVID in the world. Would you agree to come back maybe next week or the week afterwards and we can continue that conversation? I'll give you a call and we can arrange. I want to thank you very much for coming on. And now we break for Chanel and the news. Thank you very much, Dr. Justin Ram.
Welcome to Lifetime Solutions, where you can trust your roof to us. Our services include custom fabrication, steel framing, roofing installation, on-site roll forming, roofing maintenance and services. Call 223-ROOF or 223-7663 for a quote today or visit our website www.lifetimesolutionstt.com. Lifetime Solutions. You can trust your roof to us. Call 223-ROOF or 223-7663 for a quote today or visit our website www.lifetimesolutionstt.com.